Well, hello there, my kindred spirits. How are you doing this evening? I hope that every one of you are doing great. Now, as promised, this evening I'm going to tell you some ghost stories. So, if you love to hear spooky ghost stories, I want you to settle in and get prepared because I've got some good ones for you. But now, if this isn't your cup of tea and you're easily spooked, go ahead and just click off this video. I'll have another story for you another time that won't be nearly as spooky. Okay, now, I'm really excited to tell you some of these stories, and I've written them down here so that I won't forget. And let me start by telling you just a little bit of history first. I grew up in a little bitty town called Waverly, Tennessee, which is 60 miles west of Nashville. And there's a lot of history down there, a history of the early settlers and a history of the war between the states. And then also the Creek Indians were some of the earliest inhabitants of that area. When I was a little kid, we would go to a farm that belonged to my great-great-grandfather, and anytime anybody plowed the fields out there, we could walk behind the tractor and pick up arrowheads for days. It's just full of ancient artifacts out there, and so we just enjoyed that area so much. So having said that, keep in mind lots of old history out there. So let me tell you some of the things that happened to me personally, and then I'll tell you about some of the things that my grandmothers and my aunts and uncles have shared with me over the years too. Okay, so the first thing I want to tell you, this is the earliest memory that I have of a ghostly encounter, and I'll explain it to you. So this is a sad story. My uncle Junior, died in a terrible car accident in 1977. So I was 4 years old. And it was very traumatic, and he was young. And so at the funeral, he was buried in a little church in Goodlettsville, Tennessee, and at the funeral, my father was there, and he's always been a photographer, so he was just taking pictures of the family and of the church and the graveyard, and then it was a beautiful afternoon, and so he was taking a picture of a valley down below the graveyard. And there was just an old barn and then a mountain, and it was just scenic and picturesque. And so back then, you had to send your pictures off to have them developed before you could see what they looked like. So about a week later, my Granny Jean and my two aunts, my Aunt Kay and my Aunt Jenny, drove down from Goodlettsville to our house in Waverly to visit my mother. And so we were all sitting around at the kitchen table, and my Granny Jean was leafing through the pictures that my daddy had developed from the funeral. And I remember sitting next to her, and she paused, and she was looking at this one picture in particular, and she said, "I see something else in this picture." And we kind of just looked at her, and she said, "I see Junior and Kathy Jean." And Kathy Jean was a baby that she had lost when she was just about a week old. And so we thought she was crazy. And so we got the picture from her, and she pointed out to us what she was seeing. And sure enough, there in the mountain, in the leaves of the trees, it looked like an image of my Uncle Junior standing there. And right next to him was a little infant baby girl. And we were just mesmerized at seeing that picture. And I still have that picture. And, you know, if you knew my uncle, you would be able to see him in that. And again, that little baby sitting right there next to him too. So that was my very first, I didn't encounter a ghost physically, but I did see that with my own eyes, and I have seen it years since, in the years past, and I mean, somebody could explain it away and say that it was just leaves, but you can explain it all you want to, but it's sometimes those things like that are a comfort too. And if anybody knew him or saw pictures of him and then saw what we were pointing at, they would all agree that it looked just like him. So that was interesting. And I do want to tell you too that my entire family, both maternal and paternal, they all have been very intuitive, and I won't say psychic, but they all are very intuitive people, and they pick up on things. And so that's where a lot of this is coming from too. So anyway, that's my very first story. Now, the second one that I want to share with you that happened was shortly thereafter that. My brother and I were little, and I had twin beds in my bedroom, and he slept in the other twin bed next to me. We are 23 months apart. And so we were probably about maybe 5 and 3, maybe a little bit older, but not much older. And so we were laying in bed one night, and my parents were asleep in their bedroom, and there was a really bad storm happening. And so the lightning was just lighting up the sky through the windows, and the thunder was just booming. It was a very scary night, but we were laying there in bed scared to death with the covers pulled all the way up to our chins, just waiting for that storm to pass. It was very loud. So we heard a noise, and what my little brain envisioned was that somebody was running through the hallway with a baseball bat, hitting either side of the hallway. That's what it sounded like to me. It sounded like it was in the house. And so we were laying there looking toward the hallway. The hallway door was open. And suddenly something came into the hallway and stopped. And it hovered there for just a few seconds. And it was a giant blue ball. And it looked like it was pulsating, and it just hovered there for a few minutes, and then it went out the window in the opposite bedroom, and it made a lot of loud racket, and it was gone. So my brother and I both sat up in bed when that happened, and I remember us looking at each other because we could see each other with all the lightning happening outside, and it scared us both to death. And then when we told our parents about it, if it was one little kid telling you that, you might think they just had a bad dream. But both of us saw it. And so my father said that it could have been a phenomena called ball lightning. I'm not sure. But anyway, that was a really spooky thing that we both witnessed seeing. And there wasn't anything on the walls, like that indicated something was being hit. So I don't know what that sound was, but I know that I saw it, and my brother saw it too. So that was a scary thing to see when you're a little kid like that. Now, the next story I want to tell you about is about this is on my paternal side of the family, and this would be my grandmother. And my other grandmother, her name is Clara. That first Granny Jean was my maternal side. So my daddy's mother, Clara, my grandmother, told this story of when she was a little girl, and my brother and I were just fascinated by this one. And she said that she had an uncle who was addled, so he just wasn't right in the head. Something was a little bit wrong with him. And when they would all gather to go to their grandparents' home, he would not walk up the front porch steps to their house. He just would not go. He was paranoid. He would not go, so he would walk around to the back porch and go in the house. And he wouldn't really give an explanation. So One time, one of the uncles got him to explain to him, why won't you go up those steps? What's wrong with you? And he would just pull away and say, no, 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 the witches will get me. The witches will get me. I'm not going up those steps, no. And he would not, for the life of him, go up those front porch steps. So one day, some of the uncles decided, we're going to find out what's underneath those steps. What's going on here? Why is he not wanting to go up those steps? And nobody knew of any reason. So all they knew was that the uncle would always just say, no, 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 the witches will get me. The witches will get me. That's all they knew. So they pulled the steps off and didn't see anything. But they got their shovels out and started digging. And they found this little box that was buried under the ground there. And they opened it up, and there was a long, dark braid of hair tied with a blue ribbon. And there was no notes attached, no nothing, no indication of who it belonged to or anything. So I don't know what they did with it. They got rid of it. They threw it away, burned it. I'm not sure exactly what they did with it, but they got rid of it, covered the hole back up, put the steps back in front of the house because they were just wooden steps that could be detached. And then they just went about their business. Well, the next time the family came around to the grandparents' house, that addled cousin came around, and he walked right up those front porch steps. And nobody had said a word to him about what they had uncovered and what they dug up. He just somehow knew. And so, I guess after that hair was gone, he just discovered and somehow knew that it was okay to walk up those steps. Those witches weren't going to get him anymore. So that was kind of a spooky thing to hear about all my childhood, all my growing up. Now, another couple of stories that we heard was from our great-grandmother, and her name was Idabelle Page Mayberry. And she grew up on a farm that sits along the Duck River in Humphreys County, Tennessee. And that part of Tennessee, again, was inhabited by the Creek Indians. They were the first people there. And so there was lots of interesting history out there. And I don't know if it was just because I had grown up hearing these stories that I was open to it or what, but it was always part of my being, hearing these tales. And so I just thought everybody grew up hearing stories like this about their own families too. But my brother and I were very fortunate to get to spend quite a lot of time with our great-grandmother. She died when I was 11. And so we spent a lot of time with her at her house. And so she would tell us a couple of different stories that she experienced as a child out there. And so one of the stories that she told was that when she was little, she would be in the bed, and she slept in what was called a cord bed. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but what they would do is they would take 4 pieces of wood. You'd have the headboard, the footboard, and then the 2 side pieces of the bed. And then they drill holes in the headboard, footboard, and the side pieces. And then they would take cord or rope and run it through in sort of that scared me. I'm telling these stories and my heater just came on and made a bump. They would weave it through in sort of a woven pattern so that it would hold a mattress. And so that was what a cord bed was. So she told me a couple of different stories about the bed. One of the stories she said was that she would lay in that bed at night and something would pull her covers off. And so she'd try to get them back, and she'd cozy back up, and then something would pull them off again. And there were no siblings at the time in the house pulling those covers off, so that was an odd thing. And then she also told me how she would lay in the bed, and the cording would feel like it was off, because sometimes you had to go in there and tighten it back up and knot it back up. But she said one night she fell to the floor, And every one of those pieces of cording, the knots had been undone in that bed. And so that was spooky. You know, that was a spooky, odd thing to happen to her. So the next story that my great-grandmother would tell us about was about some noises in the attic that she heard. She and two of her siblings witnessed this. So nobody else was home. And they were in the downstairs part of their log cabin. They had a rather large cabin that had a little sitting room and a bedroom and then two bedrooms upstairs. And then they had attic space too, not much, but a little bit. So she said that there wasn't a whole lot in that attic except for some trunks and maybe a few pieces of furniture, but mostly trunks with their old baby clothing that they didn't use anymore. And so she and two of her siblings were at home, and they kept hearing noises that sounded like it was either upstairs or in the attic. And so they walked upstairs, didn't see anything going on, but they could hear that noise further in the attic. So they were a little afraid, and one of her brothers opened up the door to get up into the attic, but the noise stopped. So they were afraid, and they shut the door and went on back downstairs and continued doing what they were doing. And then they heard it again, but this time it sounded like kids laughing, and it sounded like a ruckus because it sounded like people were bounding along on the floor, you know, kids horse playing, but nobody was home. And so second attempt, they tried to go up there again, and when they opened up the door to the attic, the noise stopped. Well, she said that the third time they were getting a little bit frustrated because they couldn't figure it out. So the third time they walked up there and they just made a rush for it and ran up there and opened up that attic door and got to the top of the stairs. And when they did, there was some clothing that was in a circle on the floor. And they were trying to figure out why in the world was this clothing laying in a circle on the floor, and they never did figure out what that was. But I don't know if my great-grandmother made that story up or not, but she swore it was true, and it scared the heck out of me and my little brother every time she told it to us. So that was always a lot of fun to hear that. And now another time at that same old place, again, this is a family farm that is still in our family. I have a distant cousin who bought the farm and a lot of acreage around it, and he's gone in and redone it, and family can stay there if they want to and just kind of visit the area because it is beautiful. Again, family land, and there's an old graveyard where my great-grandmother is buried. Great-great-grandparents are buried. Long history of family out there. But my father and aunt and uncle told this story to me. So long after my ancestors moved off of that land, and nobody at the time was living there, they just still owned it, my Daddy and his siblings would go out there and camp sometimes because it was a great fishing spot along the Duck River there. And so one night they had set up camp, and there was an old, like a corn crib that they had kind of pitched their tent next to. And so they had set up their tent, and they were just sitting around their little campfire that they had set up. And they were just talking. And all of a sudden they heard a blood-curdling scream, and then they heard a sound like dishes being thrown on a floor, and it was coming from the house. And then they heard sounds like somebody was sweeping up those dishes. And so it scared them to death. Their hair stood up on the back of their heads. They were scared to death hearing that noise. And so they went on to sleep, which I can't imagine doing that. And then they got up the next morning and went in the house, and they didn't see any evidence of anything like that happening. There wasn't really anything in the house anymore because nobody lived there. But they said it always scared them to death, and that was 3 people who witnessed that, my father and my aunt and uncle. This was in the late 60s that they all 3 experienced that, and they never could find an explanation for that. So But again, there were lots of Creek Indians inhabited that place, and also lots of ancestors, and lots of Civil War skirmishes happened around that area, not precisely on that land, so you never know. But that was always something that just thrilled my brother and I to hear, and it was always, we always wanted to see if we could hear something like that. Now, when we got older, I was about 21, and my family had a big family reunion out there. And so we all traveled back to that home, and we stayed out there. And it was really eerie because we were sitting out on the front porch, and it was nighttime, and we wanted to hear something so badly. We wanted to hear a ghost. We did hear the beating of drums, and we could not figure out what that was from. And so it was a drum. It was a drum beat, but there was nobody in the house had drums. We couldn't figure out what it was coming from. We tried to investigate. There were some skeptics in the family who really were like, oh no, this isn't. My husband being one of them, he's an engineer, and my uncle was an engineer too, not related to the family, and they were both investigating it. And it spooked them too, because they're like, y'all are crazy. There's an explanation for it, but they couldn't find the explanation, so they couldn't find the source. So that was always kind of spooky, to be able to experience that and not have an explanation for it. And I've also told y'all about the Bell Witch too. If you go back a few videos, I'll put a link to the video in here. I read a story and told us a little bit of a story about the Bell Witch, and that was a phenomenon that happened in Adams, Tennessee, which was still northwest of where I grew up in Waverly. But we never had any encounters with the Bell Witch, but that was always something that was deeply embedded in my head as a child too, just from not so much family, but just by virtue of being in that area. You just got told stories like that as a child. I don't even know if people would tell children stories like that these days. I told my kids, but a lot of times people want to keep their children away from things like that, which I understand, but I don't know. I think there's always more than what we can see, and because I have felt those things, and I'll tell you that story. I'll save it for last, but I will tell you another story that happened between my grandmother and my father. So, because again, there's more than what you can see with your own eyes. You can feel things. You can experience things with your other senses and feel things happening to you. So, and my grandmother and my father felt this at the exact same moment. So my grandmother was up in Baltimore, Maryland, and my father was on a train. And as he was sitting on a train waiting for it to leave, he was kind of drifting off to sleep, sort of thinking about his day and what he was going to be doing. But he was jolted awake suddenly by the voice of my grandmother saying, "Daryl." Well, at that same moment, my grandmother was walking and she fell into a hole. And my father, Daryl, was her oldest son. And I don't know why she yelled Daryl, but she did, like in the efforts to get help. But he was on a train 100 miles away. And so my father jerked out of his slumber on that train because he heard his mother's voice holler for him. And when he got to his destination, he called back home to check on his family to see how they were doing. And his mother, my grandmother, was in the hospital because she had broken her foot. And he asked her about it, and he said, I heard you holler my name. And they got their timeline down, and sure enough, the same instant that she fell in that hole and broke her foot was the same moment that she yelled out my daddy's name. So that was always kind of spooky to hear that. And I've always been open to that because we have had so many experiences like that in my life. And then, not just from my daddy's side, but my mother's side as well. So it's kind of fun, it's kind of interesting, it's kind of neat, because there is always a lot more than what we can see and with our human eyes. So that's what brings me to my very last story. And this one isn't so much scary as it is a comfort. So many of you may know that, or maybe some of you don't, but my mother died in 2010 of pancreatic cancer, and she was only 56 years old, so she was very young, and it was very sudden. It was very, very sudden, and a huge loss. I was only 37. My children were young, but they loved their mammy, and she adored them. She was crazy about those grandbabies. And so I was back at her house. She died 2 days after her 56th birthday, so she was very young. So my aunt was with her when she passed away. And I'll say this, I've always heard that people die the way they live. So my mother, when she had something to do, she wanted everybody out of her house. She was a fastidious housekeeper, and so she couldn't get her house cleaned the way she wanted it until everybody was gone. If she had work to do, she wanted people out of her house so she could get her work done. So the days leading up to her death, we brought her home. I didn't want her to die in the hospital, so we brought her home to die in her own bed. And my aunt, who was her sister-in-law, had told my daddy and my brother and us too. She told my husband, "You've got to get those Lindy and the kids out of the house because Connie is not going to die with those children here." So Chris told me, "We've got to go. Let's go back home." And so we drove back to North Carolina. And then that night, my aunt convinced my daddy and my brother, who was also there, to go to my grandmother's to sleep. And she'd stay there and watch my mother. And she was a nurse. And so she said that she slipped out of the room for just a minute, and she said, "Connie, do you want me to get you anything? I'm going to go in here and get something to drink." And my mother told her no. And so she walked back in the room after she got her drink, and my mother was gone. So it's just interesting, first of all, that my mother had work to do. She needed to die. And she wanted to do it on her own terms, and that meant to get all those dang people out of her house so that she could get to work. And she did, and she was able to pass away in peace. My aunt said it was peaceful. She got my aunt out of the room too, and she wasn't gone but just a minute, and then my mother went ahead and she passed away. But it was so neat, because the next day I came back to the house. We drove back to Tennessee from North Carolina, and I was exhausted. It was devastating that she had died, and I was trying to get things in order for her funeral. So I went back to the back bedroom, and I laid down for a little bit, because I just needed to lay down and rest for a little bit. And my children were there with my husband and my daddy and brother, and they were at the front of the house, and the house isn't that big. And so as I lay there, I had drifted off to sleep, and it felt like something had jumped up on the bed with me. It was shaking like crazy, and it felt like all three of my kids had jumped on the bed, is what it felt like. And so the bed was being jostled by three little children, is what I kind of assumed. But have you ever experienced sleep paralysis? If you haven't, it's just a phenomenon where you're aware of something that's going on, but you cannot move. So that's what I assume I must have been experiencing, because I thought that my kids were on the bed, but I couldn't open my eyes and I couldn't move. But in the next few moments, as I was laying there, I smelled my mother. She just, everybody has a distinctive scent. You can smell your children, you can smell your babies. Everybody sort of has a distinctive smell. And so, fragrance, not smell, it wasn't bad. But so my mother had a distinctive fragrance. So I smelled her very strongly, first of all, like she was right up next to me in this sleep paralysis that I was having. And then as I lay there, I felt a hand just stroking my cheek, and I could smell my mother. And I was very comforted. I felt her presence. I smelled her, and then I felt this stroking of my cheek. And it was comforting. It was like being just enveloped in a warm hug and embraced by her. And so I woke up from that. I finally kind of got out of that paralysis feeling, and I woke up. And then when I walked into the living room to ask my husband, did you let the kids in there to wake me up? He looked kind of surprised, and he said, no, I know you needed some rest. No, I did not let them in there. So he had not let those kids in there with me. And it was, you can't tell me it was not my mother who had come in there to just let me know that everything was going to be okay. So that was a big comfort to me to experience that. And then let me tell you one last story. This could go on for a long time, but let me tell you this one quick last story, and then we'll be done with them for the night. When my daughter was born, she was it was kind of scary. She was our last baby, and we had a great, it was the day of the Christmas parade. And so we took our boys to the Christmas parade and had a lot of fun, and we'd made Christmas cookies that day, and everything seemed to be fine. Everything was going well. And so that evening after the Christmas parade, my husband went on to lay down because he was exhausted from work. And so I put my little boys to bed, and then I got busy cleaning the house. My daughter wasn't due for another month. And so I got really busy cleaning the house, and everything was clean and looked so pretty. And then I sat down to have a little snack. And so I remember eating some cheese and some peanuts, and I drank some chocolate milk, and I sat down to watch the Andy Griffith Show. And it was the Loaded Goat episode. If you've never seen it, you'll have to find it. It's a great episode. So I sat down to watch that, enjoyed that, and then I went back to my bed. And I was laying there reading a baby book about baby names, and my son Nate came into the room, and he laid with me for a little bit, and he was only about 4 years old. And so we were looking through the baby book, and I didn't know if it was going to be a boy or a girl, and he told me he wanted that baby to be named Bobby. He just liked the name Bobby. And so we were laying there sleeping or laying there looking through the book, and then I decided, well, it's time to go to sleep. So I turned out the light, and then again, my husband was in the guest bedroom asleep, and I just thought, I'm not going to wake him up. I'm just going to let my son Nate lay here with me. And so we were just laying there talking, and all of a sudden I felt something really warm, and scared me because I thought, did my water break or what? And I turned on the light and looked under the covers, and it wasn't water breaking, it was blood, bright red blood. I don't want to gross y'all out, but that's the grossest that it'll be. But anyway, scared me to death. So I went and I told Nate, I said, Nate, buddy, will you go get your daddy? Will you go wake up daddy, please? Mom, tell him mama needs him right away. So he went back there. Again, he's only 4, so he went back there and got Chris. And Chris came in there and kind of groggy-headed, and he said, what's wrong? And Nate was kind of standing at the door, and I said, ask Nate to go to bed. And so he put Nate in his room, and he came back, and he said, what's going on? And I said, I'm bleeding really bad. And I said, call the doctor, something's wrong. And so he called my doctor, and I could see my husband's face, and Chris didn't tell me what the doctor had said, but the doctor had told him, get her to the hospital now. So we were 30 minutes away from the hospital. So we called our neighbor and said, can you please come over and stay with the boys? We've got to get to the hospital now. And so I got my clothes on and didn't pack a bag or anything because the baby wasn't due for a month. And so we got in the car and took off and ran every red light from Wascom to Shreveport, Wascom, Texas to Shreveport, Louisiana. That's where my doctor was. So we got there, and I remember him trying to do an ultrasound, and he couldn't find the heartbeat. So that was very scary. And I had planned on having a home birth. So I didn't really want to be in that hospital anyway. And he couldn't find the heartbeat. That was very, very scary. He finally found the heartbeat, and he said, and the baby was okay, but he said, are you ready to have a baby tonight? And by this time, I was worked up. I was scared to death. And I said, and he knew I was planning on having a home birth, and I said, yes, but I said, I am so scared and worked up, and I don't have my things and in right order, and I said, I think I'm probably going to have an epidural tonight because I'm so afraid. And he said, oh honey, you're going to have an epidural. He said, you've got to have a C-section because that baby's got to come out now. Your placenta has ruptured. We've got to get her out now because you're hemorrhaging, and that baby's not going to have much more time because the placenta is the life force, of course, to the baby. And so we had to get her. We didn't know it was a her at the time. We had to get her out. So I didn't realize, though, at the moment how dire that situation was. All I could think about was, oh no, a C-section. And I was scared to death. And so everybody had left the room, and they had gone ahead and given me an IV before they knew what was going to be happening. They just, I guess that's standard procedure. They just give you an IV, get an IV started. So it was probably it was saline solution. So I remember the nurse coming in and telling me what was going to be happening, and again, scared to death. And I remember my husband, we did have a cell phone at the time, and he was telling my mama she's going to have the baby tonight, and he handed the phone to me, and mama said, everything's going to be okay, you're going to do a great job, and it's all going to be good. And we hung up, and I thought, well, bless my mama's heart for being so brave. But what I didn't know is my husband didn't tell her anything, because she was all the way in Tennessee, and she would have probably just passed out on the spot, you know, scared to death for her daughter. He didn't tell her how dire the situation was either. So the nurse came in, and we got ready, and she was pushing me down the hallway to get into the operating room. And I had been praying the whole time, God, please let this baby be okay. Please let me be okay, because I thought one of us was going to die, and I wanted it to be me. I did not want that baby to die, but I was hoping it wasn't going to be me too, because I had 2 other children at home, little ones to take care of too. So I was scared to death laying there. And sorry, my heater just came on, and it sounded like somebody knocked on my door, so I'm telling these stories, and it's kind of scary. So I was laying there on the bed. She was pushing me into the OR, and we were talking. She was very comforting. And all of a sudden, I'd been praying like crazy. All of a sudden, my body felt like somebody had dipped me into a vat of warm water. And it was peace. It was the most serene peace that I have ever felt in my entire life. Even more serene and peaceful than after my mother died, because I was still very sad at that moment. But this was just an amazing peace. And again, warmth. I had been freezing. It was December, it was chilly, and I was freezing to death. And it just, all of a sudden, I was warm, and my heart rate had just slowed down, and it was like calm peace. It was beautiful, so peaceful. So I asked the nurse who was pushing me into the OR, I said, "Whoa, what did you just give me?" That was the best drug ever. But my mind was fine. It was just my body was peace. And she said, "Well, honey, I ain't giving you anything yet. All that is saline. It's just, we just had to get the IV started. You haven't gotten your medicine yet. Once we get in here, we'll give you the epidural." And she said, "We don't want you to be drugged because, the epidural is the only thing we're going to give you." And she said, "You'll be awake during the entire process." And I said, no, really, what did you give me? Because that is the best drug ever. My mind is still completely cognizant, but my body just was like, again, it was the most unexplainable, beautiful feeling of warmth, calm, and love that I've ever experienced in my life. And she had to reassure me several times, "Honey, there's nothing in that IV bag. We haven't given you anything." So I guess God heard that prayer, that plea, and there was just a calming peace that came over me, and it was beautiful. And she was born, again, by cesarean. She was fine. She was a month undercooked, and so they had to put her in the NICU, and but she was fine. She was just tiny. She was 4 pounds, and but she was beautiful. And my middle name is Lane, and so I didn't know what she was going to be, but if it was going to be a boy or a girl, but when they took Chris said, "Lindy, it's a little girl," and I thought, "Oh, I'm going to have to name that baby after me." And so I named her Laney. So anyway, my son, who wanted to name that baby Bobby, he called her Bobby Laney for a year after she was born, because he was mad because we didn't choose her name. But anyway, all that to say, that is, of all my spooky things that happened, those two there at the end are calming to paranormal type stories that I have for you. So I like to think of those as a big comfort and a big an answered prayer, especially for that last one. But anyway, I hope that you enjoyed that and you're not too scared. And if I hope that you're reassured by those last 2 stories at the end there. But I would love it if, first of all, if you give this video a thumbs up if you're still listening. And second of all, let me know in the comments one of your stories. I love to hear the spooky ones, and then I also love to hear the reassuring ones, because again, we just don't know. We only see little glimpses of the realms of possibilities that are going on in this beautiful world. So I would love for you to share with me your story too. My friends, thank you so much for listening to me tonight, and I hope you enjoyed this, and I can't wait to see you on the next video. Y'all sleep good and take good care.